Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on the making of contemporary India from 1950 to 1990s, today we will talk about emergency. Emergency in 1975 was a momentous event in the history of Indian politics because before that such kind of a step had never been taken in the context of the new democracy which India became from 1947 onwards. And there were a lot of hopes and aspirations among the masses that since 1947 the condition of India will improve, and a number of measures in that regard were taken from 1947 onwards, and there was a lot of thrust on parliamentary democracy. And with the coming of the JP movement in 1970s and thereafter, we see that how emergency was being imposed. Then it created a situation where a number of questions they were being raised that whether such kind of emergency was essential in India at that point of time when it was being imposed, and what will happen to the parliamentary democracy which was enshrined in the Indian Constitution. So there were some of the proponents of that the emergency, that the way it unfolded because of the circumstances, and there were others, those who rejected that such a step was detrimental to the Indian democracy and it should not have been taken place at that point of time. So these kind of debates they are there with regard to the kind of viewpoints which the various thinkers they have, and what exactly led to the situation where emergency was imposed. Then what was the course of emergency, that it was there for long 19 months, and many times we realized that how people they felt fed up in the later part of the emergency with the kind of situation which was unfolding. So we'll have a kind of a discussion on the issues which were relating to the emergency in 1975 and how the political developments which unfolded after that, how they also contributed to the emergence of a new political formation in the Indian politics. So in that context, some of the readings which you can refer, as you can see on the screen as well: Pinchandra, India after Independence; Ramchandra Guha, India after Gandhi; Indra Malhotra, Indira Gandhi; Tariq Ali, Nehru's and Gandhi's and Indian dynasty. So these are some of the readings which one can refer when talking about emergency. And when we talk about emergency, that how it was an internal emergency, and in the morning of 26 June or in the night of 25th June it was being imposed. How did it come about? Whether it was legitimate, whether its legitimacy has been questioned. In terms of practice, how emergency unfolded when you see in terms of practice. Then why was it lifted in the end? When it was lifted, what were the reasons for ending it, and what were the consequences of emergency at that point of time? So we'll have all sorts of discussion regarding the questions which have been raised about emergency, and when we tend to see when emergency was being imposed, whether it was justified in nature or it was not justified at all. And overall, when one tend to understand emergency, then we find that the imposition of the emergency by Mrs. Gandhi was flawed in nature, and she later claimed that faced with an extra constitutional challenge, she had no other option. So she argued that the way the situation was unfolding at that point of time, and how the extra constitutional challenge in the framework of the JP movement, and when JP movement was talking about the total revolution or Sampurna Kranti, and they were not arguing in the sense of the constitutional kind of a remedy which could have been sought. Rather, this kind of a challenge was extra constitutional in nature. So Indira Gandhi, she tried to justify her own action with regard to that, and she felt that resignation by her would have strengthened the forces that were threatening the democratic process and bringing country to the edge of anarchy and chaos. So in a way, she was trying to convey that she wanted to remove the anarchy and chaos which was there, and there was moreover no legal, political or moral reason why she should step down during hearing of her appeal. So she also feels that there was no reason for her, whether it was in the context of the legal framework or the political reason or any moral reason, that she should have resigned from her position, because the hearing of her appeal was going down in one of the courts. So this is what her argument was. And when we tend to understand that how Indira Gandhi, she could have taken any kind of a democratic option, she could have declared that Lok Sabha would be dissolved and fresh elections would be held in October, November. And JP and the opposition parties, they could have accepted the offer which was offered by Indira Gandhi, and some sort of a democratic resolution of this political impasse could have taken place through an appeal to electorate, and how the electorate would have behaved in the elections would have decided the further course of the Indian politics. And we see that how the opposition stuck to the demand for her resignation, and their declaration their declared methods to bring it about. She could have legitimately declare an internal emergency as only available and viable option for meeting the extra constitutional challenge. So in that context, when we try to understand that how opposition stuck to the demand that she had to resign from her position, and the way the methods, the way they used those methods in terms of bringing about this kind of a decision. So Indira Gandhi felt that internal emergency was the only right kind of a measure which was available with her, and it would have been one of the possibilities that emergency could have been lifted, and she could have announced that this kind of a situation, that emergency would be lifted as soon as the opposition would give up the demand for a resignation, and opposition agreed to adhere to the Supreme Court or Parliament's judgment and accepted the test of elections. So when you tend to see the way the longevity of the emergency, then it was there for nearly 19 months, and how there was no justification for this kind of a tenure or this kind of a term for emergency. And once it was felt that how the problems with regard to, or the threat which was there with regard to law and order situation, it was over, then the draconian character of the emergency measures, they could have been removed, and emergency could have been withdrawn. So we see that in this kind of a situation, how JP movement as well as Indira Gandhi, they did not seek the option of the elections. And when we tend to understand election in a democracy, they are in a way vehicles for the legitimization of a political regime and for the expression of the popular will. But that route was not taken by both the parties which were involved in this kind of a scenario. And the way, in the manner in which the political conflict during 1974-75 it had developed, with the tragic consequences that a political atmosphere had been created in which the dialogues and the accommodation between the two opposition forces was not possible. So such a kind of a situation, it was being created, and such kind of a perception was there among the people, that how this kind of a political atmosphere in which the dialogue as well as the accommodation between the two opposition forces, it was not possible at all. So it became some sort of a problem for the Indian democracy in that sense. And when emergency was proclaimed in India, when it was being imposed in India under Article 352 of the Constitution on the morning of 26 June or the night of 25th June, we find that how You can see the caption, you can see the slide on your screen as well, that how the normal political processes, they were being suspended, and they in a way promised to return to normalcy as soon as the conditions warranted. And President Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad in a way was in a way also criticized that he was some sort of a rubber stamp in the context that the way emergency was imposed on the Indian masses. And we find that how the federal provisions of the constitution and the other rights in the context of the fundamental rights and the civil liberties, they were being suspended during this time. And the government, it also imposed the strict censorship on the press, and all sorts of protest and opposition to the government was stifled. And so these kind of measures, which were considered to be draconian in nature, which were in a way threat to the civil liberties of the masses, the way fundamental rights of the people, they were being curtailed, how the freedom of press, it was also being compromised. So all such kinds of measures, they were a threat to the Indian democracy. And we also find that a number of leaders from different political parties, they were being arrested and under the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, MISA, and how leaders like Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Jayaprakash Narayan, Morarji Desai, even Congress dissident like Chandrasekhar, and so many trade unionists, student leaders, academicians, newspapermen, all of them, they were put behind bars, they were jailed at that point of time, and they were considered to be a threat, and that they may create such kind of a situation which may not be comfortable for the government. And we find that so many arrests, they were being made during this time, and more than 1 lakh people, they were arrested during a period of 19 months, though many of them, they were released also after some time. But such kind of arrests, they continued during this period. And how during this time we see that a number of antisocial elements such as smugglers, hoarders, black marketeers, and known gundas, those who were, they were also arrested during this time, and which also created some kind of a situation of calm during this period. And we find that how parliament during this time became utterly ineffective, and how the governments, especially the state governments, they were controlled by the center. And we find that 2 non-Congress governments of DMK in Tamil Nadu and Janta in Gujarat, they were dismissed in January and March 1976, despite being quite compliant. So we find that how emergency was unfolding in various kinds of ways, and how such kind of steps, they were being taken which were not conducive to the parliamentary democracy. And we find that how Congress as a party was also controlled, and internal democracy within the party was more or less completely snubbed at this point of time. And we find that from the second half of 1976, Youth Congress, which was led by Sanjay Gandhi, became more important than the parent organization. And many of the decisions which were taken by the Congress at that point of time had some kind of imprint of Sanjay Gandhi, and how senior politicians as well as bureaucrats, they were in a way also controlled by Sanjay Gandhi, who was also not part of the government as well. So we find that how a series of laws and constitutional amendments, they reduced the power of judiciary to check the functioning of the executive, and the Defence of India Act and MISA, they were amended in July 1975 to the detriment of the liberties of the citizens. And we find that how the some kind of an effort was also made with regard to bring about a change in the civil libertarian structure of the constitution through the 42nd Amendment. And the 42nd Amendment putting an end to the judicial review of constitutional amendment, because it was said that judiciary was obstructing pro-poor socio-economic measures in the name of defending fundamental rights. So it was laid that there would be no limitation whatsoever or whatever on the power of parliament to amend the constitution. So these kinds of measures, they were being taken so that the civil libertarian structure of the constitution could be compromised, and over a period of time, that after emergency all those kinds of measures which were being taken, they got reversed as well. And we find that how the fundamental rights, they were indirectly emasculated by being made subordinate to an expanded version of the directive principles of state policy embedded in the constitution, and how emergency concentrated the unlimited state and party power in the hands of the prime minister, which was to be exercised through a small coterie of politicians and bureaucrats around her. So we find that how, when you tend to understand the way people, they were receptive to emergency, the way they saw emergency, the way it got unfolded, then we find that a section of the intelligentsia, it reacted to emergency with marked hostility, and a large majority of people initially responded to it with passivity or acceptance or even support. And we find that it was only from the beginning of 1976 that emergency started becoming unpopular. So why was this kind of a delayed reaction in the context that why emergency became unpopular only after from 76, and why it was not unpopular in the second half of the 1975? So we find that initially people, they were not even aware, because such kind of a situation had unfolded in India for the first time, and many of them, they were passive or they accepted the way situation unfolded in that manner, in the way it got unfolded, and some of them even supported the emergency situation because the way some of the changes which were brought about, the people liked them in some manner, but in the long run we find that it became totally unpopular, and people, they did not have any kind of an experience in the recent memory of any kind of authoritarian rule. So they were in a way bewildered, they were confused, and they had this kind of fear of the unknown. And we find that apart from the arrest of the opposition leaders, repressive measures, they were there against all the antisocial elements or against the extreme communal fight or minuscule far left. So all these kinds of measures, they were also being taken. And we also find that how with the restoration of the public order and the discipline when emergency was being imposed, many people, they felt that they got relieved that country had been saved from some kind of a disorder and chaos, as has been argued by Bipin Chandra. And they also felt that how whatever measures which were being taken during the emergency, they could have been taken even without an emergency. It was the proponents, those who support those kind of measures, they fail to realize that those kinds of measures, they could have been taken even without imposing the emergency, and all sorts of positives which have been talked about, those measures, they could have been taken by the government without imposing any kind of emergency which was considered to be draconian in nature. So arguments of Bipin Chandra in this regard, that many people, they felt that they had been saved from disorder as well as chaos, but it could have been seen in a very short term kind of a context, but in the long term, in the context of the constitution, in the context of the issue of fundamental rights, civil liberties, freedom of the individuals, then this argument may not have that kind of a value. And even if when one can talk about that how there was less crime in the cities, and how the violent demonstrations, they came to an end, and there was less tension during this time, there was a calm and tranquility in the campus as the students and teachers they went back to the classrooms. So all these kinds of situations which have been in a way communicated to be positive in nature, which were to be seen to be positive in nature, all those developments could have taken place even without the imposition of the emergency. And there are arguments in the support of emergency, that how the general improvement in the administration took place, and how the government servants they came to the office on time and they were seen to be considerate to the public, and how dramatic and well publicized action was taken against the anti-social elements, those who were either the illegal traders or tax evaders or hoarders, black marketeers, and how many of them they were put behind the bars under MISA. But these kinds of things they could have taken place even without putting so many people under any kind of a jeopardy in terms of emergency. And we find that some kind of a dramatic improvements in economic through though only some of it was really due to the steps which were taken under emergency, and some of it being the result of the excellent rains, and some of the policies which were initiated, they were initiated much before emergency. So some kind of improvement in the price situation takes place during this time, and the prices of the essential goods including the foodstuffs came down during this period, and their availability in the shops as well, it also improved during this time. And when we talk about the kind of measures which were initiated by the government, then we find that for the socio-economic uplift of the people of the rural section of the society, a number of measures they were being initiated by the government, and the government it promised to liquidate the existing debt of the landless laborers, small farmers and the rural artisans, and it would extend the alternate credit to them. It would abolish the bonded labor. It would implement the existing agricultural land ceiling laws and distribute the surplus land to the landless. It would provide house sites to the landless laborers and weaker sections, as is argued in the 20-point program. And it would also revise the upward minimum wages of the agricultural labor. It would provide a special help to the handloom industry. It would bring down the prices, prevent any kind of a tax evasion and smuggling, increase the production, streamline the distribution of the essential commodities, increase the limit of the income tax exemption to Rs 8,000 and liberalize investment procedures, as it was argued in the 20-point program. And a number of measures they were also taken to implement this program, and we find that quick results they were being produced in terms of the reduction of the prices, free availability of essential commodities, and check on holding, smuggling and tax evasion. So all these kinds of things they were happening at that point of time, and how the upliftment of the rural poor was the concern of the 20-point program, and the way 3 million house sites they were being provided to the landless and the Dalits at this point of time, and about 1.1 million acres of surplus land was also distributed to the landless. And landless labor, the way landless labor was functioning, and the way bonded labor was also there at that point of time. So bonded labor was made illegal, and but we find that not much dent was made in the practice, as the issue of bonded labor could be seen in the later times as well. So we find that how laws they got passed in different states, and placing a moratorium on the recovery of debts from the landless laborers and small farmers, and in some cases to scale down or to liquidate their debt. But the scale of alternate credit provided through the nationalized banks and the rural cooperative institutions, it was small, and the dependence on the moneylenders who were the big landowners, it also remained during this time. And we also find that the minimum wages for the agricultural laborers they got enhanced, but their enforcement was again very tardy in nature. And we find that the rural segment of the 20-point program it ran out of steam, as its progress was hindered by the large landowners and the rich peasants and an unsympathetic bureaucracy. So all these things, they were also there in terms of the situation which was unfolding at that point of time. And we find that how when you tend to understand important concerns, then the one many major factor in the people's acceptance of emergency was its constitutional, legal and temporary character. And it was proclaimed under the Article 352 of the Constitution, and it was approved by the Parliament and legitimized by the courts. So to the people it represented an interim measure, because they saw it as an interim measure and temporary suspension of the normal rules and the institution of democracy. So we find that how when we tend to understand the character of emergency, then it had the kind of acceptance of its character in the framework of the constitutional, legal and its temporary character was also in a way understood by the people, and the way it was being approved by the Parliament and legitimized by the courts also provided some kind of a legitimacy to it. And in the long run, the people those who understood that it was an interim measure, and the way temporary suspension of the normal rules and the institutions of democracy had been done, and in the long run the situation will become comparatively better when all these kinds of restrictions which have been imposed, they will be reversed. And so I'd like to end the discussion at this point of time. We'll continue further when we will talk about emergency in our next lecture. Thank you very much.